everyone. Welcome to Interchange. I'm Dan Jones. Thank you so very much for joining us. Lots to talk about today. The gruesome execution of Marquette grad James Foley. We'll talk about the ongoing violence in Ferguson, Missouri, and whether Milwaukee could be next. We will also talk about the University of Wisconsin system asking the state for a healthy bump of $95 million in additional state monies. And we'll talk about whether the Amish should have to follow the same laws as everybody else here in Wisconsin. Okay, let me introduce everybody. Of course, you know longtime newspaper columnist Joel McNally, Kevin Fischer, who spent many years as a broadcast journalist, as did Denise Callaway, now communications and public relations professional. Rick Horowitz will be along with commentary at the end of the show. All right, let's talk first about the gruesome beheading of James Foley by Islamic extremists. It is being condemned by most of the world, but is there really anything anybody can do about it, Kevin?
I think so. It starts with the correct move by the Obama administration to coincide with the boots on the ground in Iraq to support that with our airstrikes. Those seem to have worked. It's going to take more than words, though, and more than strong words from our president. You're going to have a specific plan of action and strategy. Nobody likes war. Nobody likes armed conflict. But I think it's going to have to come to where, military aggression has to take place. The Islamic State, ISIS, whatever you want to call them, they're growing in numbers. They're being more aggressive. They're recruiting terrorists from all over the world, including this very country. But they show signs of vulnerability. Their numbers are only about 15,000. They're trying to control and cover an area that's about 4 times the size of Israel. Their supply lines have been stretched. So I think they can be attacked and taken out. The president said, ultimately, these people fail. And that's probably true, but ultimately can take a long, long time. And you don't want that to happen because you have the possibility of them gaining even more power, and who knows how many thousands of lives could be destroyed in that time. You have to have a strategy, I think, to take them out sooner than relying on ultimately.
Denise, we all know this is a war-weary president. This is a war-weary country. Tomorrow, let's say there's another video of another American hostage beheaded. Is there a point where the country is going to say, okay, send in the troops, let's take care of this? And would it take care of it?
I think it's a little bit difficult. And the thing we always have to remember when we're involved in conflicts like this, or we have people who have captured and are holding hostage our citizens, is that this is not a traditional kind of war. I think we saw that really clearly when the president did authorize an attempt to go in and rescue these hostages, including Foley, and it wasn't successful because the folks weren't where we thought they were going to be. This is not a traditional enemy that we're fighting. So I think boots on the ground is a lot harder to pull off because this enemy seems to sometimes evaporate into the thin air, or certainly evaporate into one of the many countries where they have a stronghold. I think that what we need to do is to understand, and I think we saw this in a way if we take a look at how the president handled the whole bin Laden situation, where he decided that there were things that they could do to track and see where people were, and when the time was right to go ahead and move forward to remove him. And that's what this president did. He didn't talk about it every day. He didn't say this is my strategy, but there was clearly and obviously a strategy that to protect the lives of the people who were involved, both those people who were befriending us and helping our country when it came to tracking bin Laden, as well as those individuals who put themselves in harm's way, that he can't always talk about the plan that he has, but because he doesn't talk about it doesn't mean there isn't a plan.
Do you put, as President of the United States and Commander-in-Chief, do you put thousands of American lives in jeopardy because you lost one American?
I don't think you do. And I agree with Denise. This president has shown they're very good at surgical actions, and that's really the kind of actions you need to do in these kinds of situations. She's absolutely right. This is not, I was so disappointed that it wasn't just automatic. We saw this gruesome murder on video, or many people did. I certainly didn't want to and didn't. And I think it should just be automatic that both parties come together behind this country when one of ours is attacked like that and murdered. And to use it politically to criticize the president, or he's not being tough enough, and he's like, encouraging people to do things like this because he hasn't put boots on the ground and he hasn't, moved more troops in to have another war. There are always these war hawks in the Congress who are so eager to go to another war. It just floors me. It took us 10 years apiece to get out of the 2 wars that we quickly got into foolishly under the Bush administration. Instead of treating the problem, which are murderers and terrorists who are hurting Americans, who sneaked into this country and flew planes into some buildings and created a horrible tragedy, we compound the tragedy by immediately going to war. It disgusts me because it is so. We play it out over and over and over, and we know that it leads to nothing but heartache and heartbreak, in this country, and loss of young lives. The fact that there are people in Congress chomping at the bit, and also there are people at Congress not just uniting behind this president and saying, the president said exactly the right thing. We are going to be relentless. And to say, well, he's not moving fast enough. Relentless isn't fast enough. Or we have to, make some big public displays and take out some people and kill some innocent people. That'll show them. Clearly, the enemy in this case does not care about that. They don't care about loss of life on their side anymore.
They're the worst.
Any more than the people
they're the
that
worst
they're
people
murdering
on the planet who have this celebration about crucifying people and killing them and enslaving them and raping them. And you can't sit. I wish we could sit down at a negotiating table and try to talk peace with them, but that would be futile.
One of the problems with ISIS, though, is that it's not just that they're holding Americans hostage. They're holding Westerners hostage for ransom. So one of the problems that we have as a country is something that I think is the right thing for us to do, and that is to say to terrorists, we're not going to negotiate with you, and we're not going to pay ransoms for our citizens
because
to
then
be
they
relieved.
Win.
Because then they
win.
do.
That empowers them, and they win.
It puts the president in an absolutely horrible situation. Whether you decide you're going to negotiate with these people knowing that you're empowering them to take more Westerners hostage, or you don't, and something like this happens.
All right, next topic. In Ferguson, Missouri, there's been rioting and protests the past 2 weeks following the fatal shooting of an unarmed black man by a white police officer. This week, a Milwaukee alderwoman, McNally said that Milwaukee is just a death or two away from being Ferguson because she says the same kinds of conditions exist here. Do you agree with her at all?
I don't. I'm sure that was not her intent, but her comments could be construed as almost endorsing or encouraging similar types of behavior if, God forbid, some kind of situation would occur in Milwaukee as in Ferguson. I put more faith in our citizenry that it would not react the way things have occurred in Ferguson. I have more confidence in our police department that they would not bungle how they reacted to what transpired in Ferguson. And we should be, I think, people like McNally, we should be ambassadors and cheerleaders and advocates for our city, and not even suggest, as it was suggested some time ago, that we could be another Detroit. And now we hear this week that we could be another Ferguson. I don't think so. I could see this happening in New York or Los Angeles or Philadelphia or much larger urban areas in America. But I honestly do not think it would happen here. I have more faith in the people that live here, I think, than Alderman Cox.
But I think there are other people that have openly wondered the last 2 weeks, okay, if the decision comes out that the officer involved in the shooting at Red Arrow Park doesn't get charged, that there could be problems here.
Well, I think what people are talking about is the level of frustration that they have about a number of different things. Certainly the fact that it seems to have taken so long and we still don't really have any answers about what happened in Red Arrow Park that day when that young man lost his life. I think that adds to frustration that people have. I have to tell you, after reading what the Alderwoman said and then actually reading what's in the Journal Sentinel, I think the disservice here, quite frankly, is from the Journal Sentinel.
Was she taken out of context?
I believe that they took out those phrases that seemed to be the most inflammatory and left out some of those things that really did explain what she was talking about.
That's what newspapers do.
But you know, newspapers, I think, as guardians of the free press and as guardians of information, have a responsibility, and I think they fell short on that. What she was saying right after that section where she talked about the fact that she was concerned about Milwaukee perhaps being 1 or 2 deaths away from Ferguson was really talking about the fact that that doesn't have to happen. This happens in communities where there is a sense of hopelessness, a sense of frustration, a sense of feeling that there is unequal policing, and we can do something about all of those things if we decide we want to do it. And that, I think, was a key point that she was trying to make, that unless you actually took the time to read her whole statement, you did not see. But I do think that what she's also reflecting is the very real frustration that not only her constituents, but a significant number of people of color in this community feel, because there is that feeling that there is unequal policing in this community. And the police department will tell you there are reasons why that happens. But when we have such a small percentage of people who are actually causing issues in communities that seem to have that sense and feeling of unequalness, it causes frustration in people. It would cause frustration to you if that was happening out in Brookfield. So I think what the Alderwoman was trying to do is to make a point to say, look, we're at a tipping point here. Not that this is going to happen, but we're at a tipping point. What can we do to make sure we don't become the next Ferguson? And that's the point that I think it was a bit disingenuine not to include when you're talking about the statement that she made about a death or two away from another Ferguson.
Do you think the level of anger and the level of frustration here in Milwaukee is the same as it is in Ferguson?
I think it's very high here, and you can understand why it would be. We all know, and they keep coming out week after week, that we're on the wrong end of all kinds of racial statistics, whether it's education or murder or what. And people are absolutely right when they talk about unequal policing, things that go on in the black community that would never go on in any white community. I've talked before on this show, the anal searches. I was appalled that everyone in this community, black and white and brown, didn't just rise up and say, you don't do that to citizens. You don't do that to people on public streets who you stop. You don't do it to people in my white neighborhood. Why are you doing it to people in that black neighborhood? They're citizens too, and to automatically assume that because they're black, they're criminal, they're drug dealers, we can go into their bodies searching for things, in broad daylight by making them drop their pants. I mean, that is just appalling that any citizen would be treated that way in a democracy. But the white community did not say, my God, what's our police department doing? No, until it's finally now starting to cost this city money because a jury, and it wasn't an all-black jury, there were white jurors who said, no, you can't do that. And they awarded $500,000 to just the first case, and there's something like 60 cases that are going to be tried. So it frustrates me that the white leaders do not stand up to obvious injustices that are unequal, and that's what Milwaukee is trying to get attention to.
All right, next topic. Remember a few years ago when the then president of the UW system was raked over the coals for asking for $21 million in additional state aid? Well, he didn't get the money, was told to tap into a huge reserve fund that the system had, and legislators then told the UW system, all right, we're freezing tuition, you can't raise it. Now the new president, comes in with a request for $95 million in additional state monies. How do you think this is going to go over with lawmakers, Denise, and the legislature, and the governor, rather?
Well, I think
depends on who the governor is, doesn't it?
That does make a difference. That does make a difference. I think what we have to stop doing is looking at the UW system like it is any other form of government, because it's not. The UW system is a governmental body that in many ways shapes what the next decades will look like in this state. Are we adequately preparing young people for the jobs that exist? Are we holding on to the best professors quite frankly, that we can find in the United States to guide our young people and to guide the university as it walks through this process of ever changing to meet the demands of this community? In this state, you can't do that. I think if you do it on the cheap, then what you get is the cheap. And quite frankly, as a parent who's paying tuition, I am grateful for the fact that tuition is frozen. But that doesn't mean that I don't, my goal is not just to have the cheapest tuition I can find. My goal is to have a system that provides the best education possible for my child. So if I'm already paying high tuition, but I'm not getting the best folks I can get to prepare my child and guide my child towards a future, what difference does it make? We have got to start looking at the UW system as what it is and what university systems are in so many other states. An economic vehicle that helps to fuel the long-term economic growth of a state. And if we decide we're not going to invest the money, then we shouldn't be surprised 5, 10, 15 years from now when we don't have the best professors around, when the system is not able to be flexible because it's really locked into what it's doing, and we're not able to respond in a way that makes us an attractive place for employers to be.
But if you look into the crystal ball, Kevin, I would predict that the legislature is not going to let them raise tuition.
They're going to be very cool to this idea. And Denise, I think you can relax. The UW system, especially in Madison, they're providing a great education, one of the best educational institutions in America. And I think that will continue because we're not cheap when it comes to supplying money to our UW system schools. One of the reasons you have a 2-year freeze on tuition, and one of the reasons you will continue to have a freeze on tuition if Governor Walker is reelected, is because parents and legislators, who will have the ultimate say, were outraged when they found out that the university was sitting on this humongous slush fund and still was asking for huge tuition increases. People were angry and upset, and rightfully so. So when the new guy comes riding into town, it's not real smart politically. You're not going to win friends and influence people by asking for this astronomical sum of money that I have to tell you, I think this is DOA in the legislature, and I would think there are plenty of Democrats that will say the same thing. So I think he needs to rethink how he's going to deal with this legislature, and the fact that he won't get that $95 million stash of cash. The UW system will be just fine. It's a great institution. And he says we have to do it to get high-impact talent. I think he was talking about professors and staff and so forth.
And that's roughly a third of what he's talking about.
He could also be talking about students. I would submit we already have high-impact students. The problem is that when they graduate, they leave the state. That's what we should be concentrating on. How to keep those really smart intellectual kids that come out of the UW system
here. They leave the state because there aren't the job opportunities that are there. Why? One of the things that drives
because of the high taxation.
No, it is not. No, it is not. I look at my son's friends who graduated from UW. Those who left because they couldn't find the same kind of economic opportunities in Wisconsin that they could find in surrounding states.
I was shocked when I saw the headline because I thought this guy was the one that was brought in to try to schmooze the lawmakers, and I think this might have alienated a bunch of them.
Well, alienated them? This is the most anti-education state government we've ever had in this state. I think he is exactly right to say, look, there's a reason why this state is trailing all the other Midwestern states in job creation. There's a reason why we're one of the worst in the nation. All of these things are connected. It's the policies of cutting education more than it's ever been cut in Wisconsin history. What you want, and then you say, why aren't you creating jobs? Or why aren't you providing good jobs for these kids when they get out of college? The fact that he's focusing this whole initiative on job creation, on good jobs, and economic development in this state, because the state lawmakers, when they aren't beating up on education for spending money and being fiscally responsible to have some cash reserves, any corporation this size needs cash reserves. You don't spend all your money. It would be absurd.
I didn't hear this outrage when Jim Doyle was slashing.
This is absolutely.
I didn't hear that.
It wasn't slashed historic levels that they are right now.
All right, next topic. An interesting court ruling by an Eau Claire judge the other day. He said that an Amish couple violated the law by not getting a building permit. They didn't pull a permit because it would have required them to install smoke detectors in their house, and the Amish apparently don't approve of that kind of technology. Should society let them live the way they want to live, like the Amish do live, or do we have a responsibility to demand that they install smoke detectors so that there's less of a likelihood people would die if there was a fire? Which way do you go?
I was amazed that this was even an issue, to tell you the truth, because there are decades of legal decisions saying the Amish have a right to practice their religion and to live the way they want to live. The fact that the Amish, in fact, aren't trying to impose their religion on us, that's what I object to in the law, when you have people who, because of their religious beliefs, they want to make everyone else follow their religious beliefs and write that into the law: anti-abortion, anti-birth control. These are a people whose rights to practice their religion are well-founded in the law and have been supported forever with legal decisions.
But if there's a big fire and 3 children die because there are no smoke detectors, do we say, well, it's their choice?
I do think it is their choice. It is their choice, and the Amish, while they may live a much simpler life than we do, are certainly well aware of the things that can happen and those things that can go bad or go wrong, and it's a choice that they make. I do think they have the right to practice that kind of religious freedom. I do think to force them to do something that is outside of their religious freedom, really, I think is stepping outside the bounds of the law and so much of what this country was founded on. So they're adults. They understand what the possible consequences are, and they have weighed that themselves against their ability and their belief in practicing their religion and everything that comes with it. And they've decided that this is something that they feel is important to their religion, and I think they should be allowed to do it.
The courts have kind of gone both ways. Some religions will say, well, we want multiple wives. No, you can't. Other times they'll say, we don't want to get immunizations and vaccinations. Okay, you don't have to. Which way should they go?
Well, shouldn't they have learned from other cases that we don't have time to talk about here, that government needs to stay out of intruding, and especially in a case where you're asking people, you're coercing people to violate their own religious beliefs. I'll make it 3 for 3 here tonight. The Amish, they're a quiet, peaceful community. They don't bother anybody. They just want to be left alone, and yet we have pencil-pushing bureaucrats in big government wanting to push them around and control their lives, and it's punitive. It's a punishment for their religious beliefs. The fines could be up to $309,500. Come on. And to close, I don't want to make light of this, but you brought up the whole issue of a fire. Seriously, when was the last time you heard of a fire in an Amish community where people were killed? I don't remember.
All right. Well, back to Ferguson, Missouri for just a minute, where tensions have seemed to ease just a little bit. That is a good thing. But Rick Horowitz thinks it all could have happened days ago, if not for one man's willingness to keep the pot boiling. Rick.
This is the happiest man in all of Ferguson, Missouri. He's Thomas Jackson, the police chief. And it could have been an embarrassing couple of weeks for him. First, one of his policemen pumps a half-dozen bullets into an unarmed 18-year-old and kills him. Then he refuses for days to release any details about the shooting, not even the policeman's name. The people of Ferguson are understandably angry. So then, to make sure those people know who's in charge, he sends his men into the streets in gas masks and riot gear with assault weapons and armored vehicles. It doesn't work. Meanwhile, folks all across the country, all across the political spectrum, are outraged at the chief's overreaction. So then the governor pushes him aside and brings in the state highway patrol, to take charge and to calm things down. Embarrassing enough, right? But then the highway patrol actually does calm things down without acting like an occupying army and by treating protesters like human beings, hugs instead of Humvees. It's a night of peace, of relief, even a bit of celebration. Well, you can imagine how that must have felt. The chief is irrelevant, ineffective, and he's been shown up by those people and by a highway patrol captain who is one of those people. Well, you can't have that. So the very next morning, Chief Jackson finally releases the name of the officer who shot Michael Brown, but he also puts out video of Brown allegedly stealing cigars from a convenience store. Now, the cop who stopped Michael Brown had no idea that he was a suspect when he stopped him, as the chief himself admitted a few hours later. Totally unrelated events, just a way to trash the victim. But he had to release the video right then, he insisted. Reporters were asking for information. And he did it without checking with the highway patrol, he admitted. He forgot that somebody else was now in charge, he said. Right. And he did it despite warnings from the Justice Department that releasing the video might shatter that fragile peace of the night before, might tip the protest back toward violence, which is, of course, exactly what happened. See, he's thinking to himself, those people can't behave themselves. I was right all along. So Ferguson goes back to burning for a few more nights. Hey, a small price to pay for a police chief's pride. That'll show him.
Well, thanks, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.